Hello and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olive Esplin and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on September 3rd with Ada Nelson. Her presentation is entitled Family Search for Latinos, Reviewing AI Indexed Records. If you would like access to a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Amy Stoddard, who will be talking about who are the Germans from Russia. Before we begin, here's a little bit about our speaker. Amy earned a bachelor's degree in family history from Brigham Young University in Provo in 2022. Her academic focus included German and English genealogy, as well as Latin, English, and German paleography. Additionally, she gained experience in Russian genealogy and paleography, and undertook in-depth study of Reformation religions, with particular emphasis on Anabaptists. During her time at BYU, Amy managed the BYU Script tutorial website and contributed to the transcription and translation of English law documents. She also collaborated on DNA research projects with both the University of Washington and the BYU Family History Center. Amy now provides consulting services to private clients and volunteers at her local Family History Center. She also serves as a chairman of membership for the Intermountain chapter of the American Historical Society of Germans from Russia. If Amy is ready, we will turn the time over to her.
Thanks, Olive. Um, Welcome everyone. This is German. Who are the Germans from Russia? And I'm going to turn off my screen sharing real quick, or my video. But this presentation is a basic overview of who are the Germans from Russia. So I'm going to share a lot of information, but it's going to be very quick and very relevant to just the Germans from Russia. So just so that's a little housekeeping. We are also going to talk about their unique history and culture of the Germans from Russia and focus on their origins and migrations and the genealogical resources available for you to research their heritage. We'll also cover their experiences and current demographics, where they live today, and the challenges that you might face while you're researching your ancestors. So real quick, this is our agenda for the night. So I'm going to go over a historical background real quick of the Germans from Russia. And then we're going to talk about the impact of political changes and the subsequent migrations that came from those in Russia. I'm going to talk about how to research your German from Russia ancestors, what types of records will be available, and then I'll talk about language and handwriting helps for genealogical research. And also we'll talk about resources such as genealogical groups and conventions, which are also very important when you're talking about Germans from Russia. So quickly, this is, let's talk about the historical background. The interesting thing about Germans from Russia is that understanding the historical background of them is actually crucial to appreciating their experiences, but also to finding your ancestors. Because it's such a unique group of people and descendants, the Germans from Russia descendants still group together in a lot of ways. They have conventions, they have groups, and they're all private, and they're very helpful in everything that you want to know about Germans from Russia. So we're going to talk about the historical background, not only to see why they came to Russia, but also why they left Russia, because these are Germans from Russia, not Germans in Russia. So let's begin. So in order to understand the Germans from Russia, you have to understand that they arrived in the Russian Empire. In 1762, the Russian Empire had just acquired new land in the south, what today we would call Ukraine and the Baltic regions. But Russia, the new land in Russia was very barren, and it was very, there was not a lot of population on there. So they really wanted reliable farmers to bring that land to be fruitful. So Russian peasants were not equipped with the modern farming practices or the equipment they needed. And German farmers actually had a very a good reputation for for innovation and for using modern tools and practices. And so on July 22nd, 1763, Catherine the Great sent out a manifesto to Europe. And this went to all of Europe, but she particularly wanted to have German farmers come to her land just because of their reputation. So she not only sent out the manifesto, she sent out ambassadors to collect them and persuade them and bring them over. And so she sent that out. This was actually her second manifesto. She sent out one in December of 1762. And that one didn't have the same promises and it didn't get much reaction. So we're going to focus on the post 1763 manifesto because that's when large migration started to happen. So the interesting thing about Germany, she was a very smart for this because it was the time when Germany was kind of in an unrest period. They had just ended the 7 Years' War, and many of the cities had been destroyed. Religious persecution was still a part of daily life for a lot of Germans at that time due to Reformation practices, but also like new religions that had spread up were still being persecuted. And then due to partial land inheritance in the South and West, Germany actually was running out of land. So partial land inheritance meant that every child inherited parts of the land from their parents, not just the oldest son. And so as you parcel those lands smaller and smaller, you run out of land. So there was a lot of Germans that had nowhere to go at that time. And so these promises that Catherine the Great made were actually very generous by any standard, both historically and modern. So she offered free land with the possibility of unlimited acreage. There was no cap on this land acreage. She offered religious freedom, except to Muslims. She offered exemption from military service. She offered reimbursement of travel services. All they had to do was go and talk to the government of the land, like their local province government, and they would reimburse all their travel expenses. She offered tax exemption for 30 years, which was huge because, I mean, that's a long time to not pay taxes. And then she offered loans for building and for construction, for livestock, for starting businesses. I mean, the loans were very low, and they also had a 30-year exemption on them too. She also offered the opportunity to leave at will. She didn't force them to stay. She wasn't going to make them become German or Russian citizens. The other thing she did is free import of goods, as long as they were new to Russia, such as like new plants or new livestock. She also offered unlimited or limited oversight. They were pretty autonomous communities, both religiously and able to govern themselves with very little Russian interference. So these were huge for the Germans. So the largest migration and also the largest colony that Germans did was the Volga Germans. The Volga Germans came mostly from the Palatinate and Hesse, and they settled along the Volga River in Russia, in the Saratov province. This was about 30,000 Germans that came, and they started coming over in about 1764. They established about 100 colonies here. It was very condensed, and it was very compact farming, like farmlands. They came down through St. Petersburg, and they on the Volga River. A lot of them actually stayed in St. Petersburg or in Moscow, but I mean, most of them came down to colonize the Volga River regions. And these were mostly Catholics, and that's important to know for researching your family history. There was certainly Lutherans and Jewish people here as well, but the majority of these people that came over were Catholic. And one thing that's important to understand about Germans from Russia is they really did group together in religious communities. And these were very tight-knit, close communities. There wasn't a lot of outsiders in them. So that's important for your family history. The next group that came over were called the Black Sea Germans. Black Sea Germans arrived, began leaving. They mostly came from West Prussia, and they mostly came because of the partitions of Poland and the Prussian government taking away a lot of rights they had. This began in 1783, and 30 Mennonite families left West Prussia, and they settled up kind of in the Belarus regions instead of down in the Black Seas. But when the Black Seas opened in about 1804, those 30 families left and came down to the Black Seas. So that was the first kind of migration to Black Seas out of Germany. Odessa region is where they settled, and you can kind of see that over here. Like this is Odessa. And this was two large Mennonite communities, was the huge amount of people here. And they were mostly seeking religious autonomy, religious exemption from military service. They were pacifists. So Alexander the First was now the king, and he had sought them out. He wanted them here. The Mennonites were great farmers, especially they farmed wheat, and that was really important to have in Russia. And so he really sought them for that reason. They traveled down the Danube River and they settled there. This is where most Mennonites settled, but there was also Lutherans and Jewish people, and there was Hutterites there as well. So if you're from that ancestry, that would be important to know. In 1812, we're going to talk about the Russian Empire acquired what we called Bessarabia, or what it was Bessarabia. And then another large migration happened. These were Mennonite, or not Mennonites, these were Germans from Prussia, Baden, Bavaria, and Württemberg. These migrants consisted mostly of Mennonites, Lutherans, and Jews, but it wasn't big colonies of Mennonites. It was more like smaller colonies of them. But a lot of Lutherans and a lot of Jewish people. The biggest influx of migrants to Bessarabia actually came in 1830, and these were mostly Polish Germans after the Polish insurrection, and they left Germany or Poland or to come to Russia to get their freedom. Most of these farmers were wheat farmers, but they also had large herds of sheep and cows. It was a very large farming community. The next one we're going to talk about right here is Crimea, and that's this little island right here. Crimea was mostly settled by Catholics and Lutherans, and due to the climate, it was mostly Swabian wine farmers. They came and they farmed for wine, like grapes and stuff. These were very religiously closed communities, and I know there's definitely certainly going to be, that's the norm. There's going to be exceptions to that, but in the whole, they were forming communities as religious congregations. So the next big migration was called Volhynia, and Volhynia was settled. This is kind of where the Mennonites I told you about settled in 1883 or 1783, but they left and moved to the Black Sea. But then there was a smaller migration about 1816 of people that came in, but the biggest was in about 1831. And so after the Polish insurrection, almost every Baptist in Poland moved to Volhynia, and that's where you will find Baptist like ancestry there. So they also happen to be, so there also was people from Northern Germany, East Prussia, Galicia, Pomerania, or Poland. Volhynia also had Lutherans, Mennonites, and other smaller sects like the Moravians and the Seventh-day Adventists, and other little small ones like the Molokans. Today it's part of Ukraine. And this was also settled by Germans who had already been inside of Russia, who had already settled in Russia, but they wanted to, for so many different reasons, they moved to Volhynia. So there was a bunch of migration within Russia from Germans. So that's an interesting part of history too. So this map just shows the different migrations. You can see over here, like how many people left, like 6,400 people left from this area, and they settled here. This is the Volga Germans, this big area right here. You can see how dense and populated that is. This right here is the Mennonites and the Black Sea Germans. Here's the Crimean, and here's the Bessarabia, and over here is Volhynia. So you can see where they kind of came from, where they settled, how they traveled. That's important when you're researching your ancestry. And it's also important to know that even though these were big migrations that I told you about, the 1764, the 1883, 1783, 1804, there was a steady stream of migrants coming to Russia at almost any time period from Germany. So, but honestly, because new colonies were being created at all times. So this is a map, and it just kind of shows you kind of where the cities were, where the big populations of Germans were. And this is just a nice map to see where they were. You can kind of see how they're all grouped together for the most part. Okay, so let's talk about the political changes. So now we know why Germans came to Russia and where they settled. But let's talk about what changed and why they left and their experiences in Russia. The important thing to understand about Germans from Russia is they did not assimilate into Russian life. They did not consider themselves Russians at any point, nor did they even try to speak Russian for the most part. A lot of Germans never learned Russia at this time. Everything was done in Russia. They were very independent. They were given autonomous governments. They were allowed to govern basically with very little oversight by the Russian government. They upheld all of their German customs, their celebrations. They didn't ever wear Russian clothes unless they had to. I mean, there's a few little things they took from Russia, but for the most part, they remained Russian. They never saw themselves as, or they remained German, sorry. They never saw themselves as Russian. The other thing about German settlers, that they were very, education and religion were very important to them. They built their own schools. They only taught German in them. They didn't actually teach Russian for the most part, except basic stuff that they had to do to get by. They taught their church services in German. They wrote their records in German. Everything was done in German. There was no Russian, except there was a few people in each village that would speak Russian, that could talk to the governor, or, like kind of their interpreters. So that's a very important thing to understand about the Germans from Russia, that they never were actually Russian in their eyes. And I'm not even, but one interesting thing I learned about, they did take a few things, is that they actually use camels in their farming. And I found this picture. This is a German from Russia with her baby riding in a camel, a little, being drawn by camels. They use them in farming. They use them in a lot of different ways, including eating them, unfortunately. So here's another, so we're going to talk about what changed. So the biggest change is about 1853, the Crimean War happened. This is when people stopped seeing the Germans from Russia as a benefit to Russia, and they began to see them more as a detriment to Russia. After the Crimean War was Alexander I, he wanted to incorporate more of the Ottoman lands into Russia. And you can see right here that he had already taken this new Russia, this green part from them earlier, and that's where the new German settlers were. But now he wanted to take more of this and control the whole Black Sea. So because this affected the whole world and Europe, France and Britain and India allied with the Ottoman Empire to help them defeat the Russians. And this was very embarrassing for the Russians, and they had assumed that they would acquire these lands as easily as they had the other lands. And so when they realized that they had lost, they sort of put a little bit of blame on the Germans. One reason they did is because the Germans were not required to serve in the military. And so it kind of began persecution. It wasn't a persecution. So it also, the other important thing about the Crimean War is it made Alexander the First was actually very effective, and that it wasn't modernized, and they needed some reforms. And so the reforms are what really affected the Germans. So the first reform, Alexander II, was now the Tsar of Russia, and his big reform was in 1861, and this is him over here, and he emancipated the serfs. And if you don't know what the serfs were, they were slaves in Russia. They were Russian, ethnically Russian, but they were basically slaves. They weren't allowed to vote, or not vote, they weren't voting. They weren't allowed to marry, they weren't allowed to buy land, they weren't allowed to have businesses. They had to get permission for almost everything. They lived on estates of Russians. And so whereas Catherine, his great-grandmother, had kept the serfs enslaved, and she had kind of given all the rights that they should have had to the Germans who were coming, then Alexander II took them away from the Germans and gave them to the serfs, and he made them citizens and emancipated them. They were now allowed to own property, marry without consent, and build businesses. The problem is, because of Catherine's generosity, the Germans, there was a lot of land that they couldn't buy. The Germans were still allowed unlimited acreage. They were very wealthy, to the point that it was like excessive. And the serfs had a really big problem with this. They now really saw the Germans as hurting the Russians because they felt like they were taking the rights that serfs should have had all along. So in 1871, Alexander II, he revoked the privileges of the ethnic Germans that Catherine had given them. And he wanted them and encouraged them to participate and assimilate into the Russian culture and affairs, including in the military. So that was gone. The military exemption was revoked in 1874. He did give the Germans a 10-year grace period. And this grace period was for them to either leave Russia or to assimilate. So this is when a big migration began out of Russia, especially the conservative religions like the Mennonites and the Hutterites. This is when they left. So in 1874, between 1874 and 1879 was a huge migration into the United States. And up until 1884, you will still see the records written in German, but after 1884, you will not find them in German anymore. They will all be in Russian. So interestingly, at the same time, the United States also enacted their Homestead Act. So in 1873, which made homesteading land basically free. They also already had religious exemption of military service, and the Germans who felt slighted by the Russian government felt like United States was their new homeland, their new, the place to be for them, especially the conservative religions. So because they could still freely leave for 10 years, this is why a mass migration happened here. So the Germans from Russia went to the homesteaded land. So if your ancestors were left at this time, they would have gone to Nebraska, North and South Dakota, and Kansas, Oklahoma, places like that. Some of the Russians or Germans from Russia didn't want to leave Russia, but wanted to be away from the colonies, and they moved to Siberia and Kazakhstan. And this is also when people started moving to Volhynia again, probably to be closer to Germany. And it's important to remember that they moved together in groups still. Like if you're from Mennonites or Hutterite colonies, you're going to find a Mennonite or Hutterite colony in the United States, probably the same people that they live next to in Russia. This picture over here on the right this is a holding house for Germans from Russia. This was in a newspaper from Kansas, that when they had such a big influx of Germans from Russia, they put them in holding houses while they got them settled into the country. And sometimes they would be in there for a year or so. So they weren't pleasant, but it was better than all the rights they felt like they had left. So the next thing that happened, so that was probably the biggest migration out of Russia. The next thing that happened was the Russian Revolution. This was huge because not now where they had a mild Russification, which is just a Russian assimilation, they now had a full-scale one. The Bolsheviks and Lenin and the communist government were requiring everybody to become Russian. So at that time, there was still about 3,200 colonies in Russia and 1.8 million Germans living in Russia at that time. They revoked every privilege that Germans had. They shut down all of their schools. They shut down their churches. They took away their land, and they started doing communal farming, collective farming, I guess is what it's called. And all records had to be taught in German, taught in Russian, sorry. And the kids had to learn Russian at that point. They had to go to Russian schools. There was no more German schools. So, and that was a big change for the Germans. There was a lot of leaving at that time too. The next important thing that happened, and all of this was, there was again a steady stream of migration out, but the big migrations we're talking about was World War II. Even though Germany had forced Russification on the Germans at that time, they were still considered dangerous because they were Germans and ethnically, and they still lived a German lifestyle, even though they were still forced to be Russian. So a lot of Germans were deported in 1941, and they were deported back to Germany. And you can see in this picture over here that they were getting, this was forced expulsion. They were sent to resettlement camps in Germany and waiting, or on the borders of Germany, waiting to get resettled. This could take a year for them, some of them. Those that were not resettled were either forcibly relocated into work camps or what they called resettlement camps. A few Germans joined the military. Those are the ones who wanted to stay in Germany or in Russia. But they were given special assignments like forestry service or medics on trains. They weren't necessarily on the front lines, although I know some were. But those that stayed, when they were severely persecuted by the Russian army. The Russian army did not trust them. They didn't trust Hitler. They didn't trust the German government. So in 1943, when Hitler was sending in troops, one of their duties was to bring the ethnic Germans home. And the German army had already been doing studies on them. They knew where they were located. They'd been taking aerial photographs of their villages. They had collected genealogies. There's multiple pictures of Third Reich officers visiting German colonies, and that's what they were doing. They were collecting data on them. So when the German army came, they collected about 300,000 ethnic Germans, and they took them back to Germany. The Mennonites called this the Great Trek, and this is a picture of them leaving. This was not forced expulsion. They were leaving by choice, and they were leaving with the protection of the German army. They were also placed in resettlement camps in Poland this time. And until they were cleared by the government, this could take up to a year again. There was a lot of diseases, a lot of deaths in these camps. They just put as many people as they could into them while they sorted them out. But they had nowhere else to go, so they stayed. And then this is a picture of a resettlement camp, a couple there. It was just a waiting game for them. It's estimated that after World War II, about 30% of the Germans from Russia, so 30% of 1.8 million, had died due to the severe starvation or persecution. And there's at least 100,000 that are unaccounted for. So it was a sad time in the Germans from Russia history. So here's a little quick overview of the emigrations of the Germans from Russia and where they went. So in 1872 to 1914, they were doing homesteading lands, and then those who had got homesteaded lands were bringing over their families. So North Dakota, South Dakota, we kind of talked about this. Then also there was Canada so the United States took about 300,000 ethnic Germans from Russia, and Canada took about 7,000. They settled in I cannot say this today, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. And then South America took about 7,000 too. That's pre and post World War II, but they do have larger communities now. Oh, sorry. And Europe was about 100,000. So about 300,000, sorry. And did Germany and South Kazakhstan. So which is now today the Turkestan region. So those that stayed were resettled, like I told you. And this map shows every green dot has about 20 work camps in them. And they were in those camps from 1941 until 1955. They were not allowed to be with their families because they didn't want them. They didn't trust the Germans from Russia. They were threatened with 20 years in prison if they were caught leaving. I do want to say there are a lot of Germans, after they were released in 1955 and 56, a lot of Germans did choose to stay in Russia. And I do have ancestors in Russia still, or cousins in Russia still, and there is a lot of communities there. So I will show you those real quick. A lot of people still felt grateful to Russia, and Russia did a lot of good things for the Germans from Russia. They had a dark period in history, but overall, they really supported them and helped them in their time of need. So this is, I'm going to skip this slide for time purposes, but these are the modern day settlements of Germans from Russia. So they're kind of overlapped with the work camps because a lot of them stayed. It's not like these were horrible areas. They were Siberia, but this was their home for so many years that some of them just stayed. So, all right, let's talk now that we know the history. And the reason you have to know the history is because of all the migrations and why they left and why they came. But let's talk about how to research your Germans from Russia ancestors. It can be a little tricky because of all the things that the wars and the border changes and everything like that. So let's talk about how to do it. And this, I want to be clear, instead of doing a methodological, like how to do it step by step, instead I'm going to give you things that have worked for me, tips that I've learned, things that I've learned from researching my family and others, and just what, like things that maybe you should know about to research them. So the first thing, of course, will always be identifying the place of origin. There's just no way to research your family without knowing that. And I'll show you how, a quick way to do that. Hopefully it works for you. The second thing is once you have your place of origin, or at least a province, you need to consult atlases, maps, and gazetteers. And I know a lot of people like to skip this step, but it's very important in this case because you need to know the historical place and province and also the modern one to research them, to know where your records might be. The next thing, we will identify the potential available records and also language aids because we're dealing with German and Russian old script. And then next we'll talk about other resources such as genealogy groups and stuff like that. So determining your place of origin can be a little tricky. The reason it is important to know the history of Germans from Russia is because knowing the history and knowing the migrations in and out of Russia can actually pinpoint where your ancestors are from and also where they settled here. Everything I'm telling you about today is in the study guide or the resource guide. So if you have questions about it, you can look through that. I've linked all of the websites that I've used or all of the things I've used, so you can go back and look at it. So the first thing you're going to do to determine it is investigate the information that you have. All of us probably know who our grandma was, who our great-grandparents were. If you have 4 generations of your ancestry, you can probably pinpoint your Germans from Russia ancestors, depending on your age. But even if you're 20, you probably can. So in order to do that, if you don't know, you can consult US records, or if you're in Canada, Canadian records, South American records, look at census records, read obituaries. That's where Find a Grave comes in sometimes, passenger manifests, naturalization documents, military records, and death certificates. These might not all be 100% correct, but they're going to give you clues. The other important thing about these is that even though a lot of them still will only say Russia, but every once in a while, and I have seen it multiple times, they'll give a province, and that's a huge clue for you. The next thing you talk about is determining their religious affiliation. Because we're talking about Germans from Russia, we can say they did clump together in religious groups. And so it'll be a little difficult sometimes, especially with Jewish ancestry, because they usually lived within like in between Lutherans, Mennonites, and the Hutterites. They lived with them, and that would be a little bit more difficult. You might need a specialist in that. The other thing that's important is surnames may offer hints. If you are Mennonite, Hutterite, Baptist, or Jewish, your surname or your ancestor's surname can give you a hint to what religion they are, and actually even where they lived, if you get deep into looking for them. If none of that helps, you can examine their neighbors. Remember, they move together in groups. So if your ancestor lives in Kansas and they live next to somebody else that's from Russia, chances are they live together in Russia or close together. They might have even been neighbors. Like, remember, they're moving in family and cultural or religious congregations. And then you'll identify any migration patterns that you know about your ancestry. So if you find a passenger manifest and they came over in 1874, you know kind of who came over at that time, you can look at this, and I actually linked that too, of all the migrations out of Russia. So you can look and say, okay, they came over at this time, so they must be one of these groups, and that will help you. And then you can kind of look at the different areas they came from and hopefully pinpoint a place of origin. The last thing that's really important is, if you don't have those things, if you want a quick access, call your grandma, call your relatives. Like, oral histories have some truth in it. My grandma used to tell me about how her family lived in Russia. She told me she was Mennonite. She told me all these stories that I didn't actually connect until I became until I went to school and I was older. And then it all started like connecting, like, oh, this is what it is. And I didn't realize that I was part of the Germans from Russia group until I was older. But if I had listened, if I had put it together earlier, I would have known. Does that make sense? Like, grandma did tell me a lot of things, and family oral histories have a lot of truth to them, even if they're not all true. So I'm going to show you really quick how this all fits together. So this right here is my family. This is Anna Heinrichs. She's my great grandmother. Her husband, Julius Heinrichs, is on the other page. And I'm just going to tell you this. I didn't put him on here because it looked messy. But it says right here that Anna was born in Russia. Her parents were born in Russia. Her mom, her dad, her father, her mother. But then her son, Peter, right here, he was born in Russia. His dad was born in Prussia, and his mom was born in Russia. So we know Anna was born in Russia because she said it. And then Julius was born in Prussia, and Julius is 62. So if you looked on the previous page, Julius is 62. He's born in Prussia. So if I just look at that, he was born in 1818 in Prussia. So then I'll say, well, what kind of migrations happened after 1818 to a Mennonite community in Russia? Because he's Mennonite. So I know those two things already. So if I look through, I will find that there was 5 migrations that happened about then. Oh, and I also know he was married in Russia because of the census, other censuses. So those 3 things tell me that he had to have been in Russia between 1818 and 1842-ish. So I looked at then, there was 10 migrations that happened then. So I've already taken off hundreds of villages that it could have been. It ended up being only 5 villages after all the things that I read about him, Libanau, and then I found the one he was from Praganau Malashna colony. So it actually ended up being quicker than I thought. And I didn't actually know this until I started doing this webinar, and I'm like, how fast can I do this? So I did what I just told you, and that happened really quickly for me. And so hopefully it could happen really quickly for you. So the next thing, now that I know that, I'm going to just go with Julius Heinrichs. Now that I know he was from Praganau Malashkina, I'm going to consult a map. And the reason I want to do this, because maps are a means to an end. They help me know what historically the name was called and what the modern day name. And it also helps me know, once I consult a map and I know what the modern day is and the historical, I can determine what records are going to be there, or if they're even available, or where they would be, in what province they're going to be in today, or what country they're going to be in today. So there's a lot of maps and gazetteers that are online today, and we're going to talk about some of those. And it's important, again, to research using resources from your time period. I've already went over that. But it's also a great way to double check other people's research. So if you're going on to Ancestry and you see all these things, I've seen so many times that people will put on Pogonau, Malashna, something, Zafara, Ukraine. But that didn't exist when Julius was born or when he was married. That's a modern day province and country. And so, it's a great way to double check everything in your family history. So I'm just going to skip this because of time again. But this is his village. This is Malashna, this is Praganau, and this is his wife's village. I was able to find a historical map of Malashna colony. So another important thing, if you know, so I know Julius is from Praganau. I don't want to consult maps or atlases. It's a lot of work for me. You can Google it. There are so many so much information by Googling things. There are so many experts on Germans from Russia. So many more that could be doing this presentation than me, but they have endless information available online. They have made this their life's mission. If you want to know about your colony, if you want to know about your town, if you want to know about a specific religious group inside of a town, you can Google it, and it will almost always come up with information. It's important, of course, to always verify the sources they use. And a good way to do that really quickly is just scroll to the end of their articles, see what kind of sources they have. You can click on them, you can double check. But if they're just coming from no sources or from family trees, you should probably question a little bit, but it's still information that can give you hints. The other thing, there's no reason to do research that's already been done. So when you're relying on experts on Germans from Russia, it's important, like most of these people, this is their life. So gazetteers are, I mean, I would say gazetteers are a great way to double check. This information right here, this Moloshna colony, this is Moloshna in Russia. The reason that's important is because I don't speak Russian and I don't even necessarily read Russian. I've done Russian paleography, but I would not be able to just pick out names. This was important because I was able to say, this is what it looks like in Russian. And it gave me some information on the Moloshna colony. So you can see right here, I said they're very close, but they did have a Lutheran church, which they mean Mennonite, school, markets, and 3 factories. Mennonites, Hutterites, they were still considered Lutheran in Germany or in Russia at that time. They weren't considered like Anabaptist or the other thing is online atlases. So this is the German-Russian atlas. And like I said, there's so many experts on German Russians, and there are so many people who have made amazing atlases and maps about them. And they have literally done this by their own hand. These are not copied. This is their life work. So use their knowledge. There's also called the Russian settlement locations. Both are really great options for you. They both will give you the historical and the modern day names. But the Russian settlement locations, the Germans from Russian settlement locations will also give you history, which is actually really interesting. So they break up all of the religions and all of the colonies by religion and who the Germans from Russian. So it was really interesting. These are both great sources for you. So that's just some of the information I got from the colony I was looking at. So once you know where you're looking, so if I'm looking at Praganau Moloshna colony, I need to identify available records that there could be. Now I know that Moloshka is now in Zafora province of Ukraine. So I will not be looking in Russia for records from that. They're most likely going to be in Ukraine. Or honestly, some of the minority religions took their records with them. So they might even be in the US. So, but Russian records I would look for on my ancestors would first be revision lists. Revision lists are basically taxation records. There were 10 revisions done between 1719 and 1858. So that really does apply to the Germans from Russia. The Germans from Russia would probably begin in the 1761 to 1767 one. Revision lists are great, and they could potentially give you a family for decades, but they took so long to complete. So this revision list took from 1761 to 1767. That's 6 years. So people changed, people moved, people died, people got married. I mean, there was a lot of changes in them, and they weren't actually there wasn't a consistent time period for revision lists. It was like 10 years supposedly, but then maybe like they need to revise the last one. So it's kind of like all over the place. They are very interesting if you can find them. And this is one from Moloshna. So the other thing you would look for is a census list. Census record, there was only one Russian census done in 1897. That would only apply if your family was still in Russia at that time. My family was not, and so I wouldn't look in Russia for a census. So that would be, but if you can find it and your family applies, it's a great resource. The other next thing would be metrical books. Metrical books are basically vital records, and they were taken by local churches and sent to the state. Some of the minority religions, such as the Mennonites and Hutterites, I've said this before, will be found in Lutheran books, and they're not necessarily listed separately. It'll be like 1861, and you'll have 3 Lutherans, and then it'll say Mennonite, and then we'll list your Mennonite ancestor, and then it'll be 3 more Lutherans. It's very hard to go through if you're a minority religion to find. And I've seen Jewish people in there too. They kind of clump them all together. But these will be done in German up until 1884. And so you will need to know German script, but you will also need to know Russian, because after 1884, well, they stopped doing them, but every record is going to be done in Russian. So, and then the interesting thing, and we talked a little bit about this, the German war records are actually can be historically, can be a great resource for your family. If your family lived there during World War II, then it would be a great resource for you. They took very detailed documents and maps of family history and villages. They're hard to find. You can find them at the the Federal Archives of Germany, which is in German, or you can also find them. Family Search Images has some, but they don't list them as that. You kind of just have to search for them in your colony. These other records I have listed in the resource guide. All of them, the metrical or the revision list can be found. They have specific archives in Russia for them, and they have specific archives in Ukraine also. So those are listed in there. So let's look at some of the larger databases. And like I said, Family Search is a very large database, and they do have a lot of Russian records. It's interesting when you look at this, you'll see this is written in Yiddish. This is written in German, and then we have Russian. And so all of these are written in different languages, and the dates don't actually matter. I don't know how they got indexed, but this is how they were. This is when I looked up the Taurida Russian Empire. This came up like this. When I looked up Moloshna Colony, nothing came up. When I looked in Moloshna Colony in Family Search Images, I got lists and lists of records. I mean, thousands of them. So they're not all necessarily indexed and in nice little lists like this. And the reason is because Ukrainian records are not, they're under, oh, sorry, I forgot the word. They're not, they can't be on Family Search indexes. They have to be only in images. So they're letting Family Search use them, but only if they're not archiving or indexing them, if that makes sense necessarily. I cannot remember the word for that. I'm so sorry. But here's an example. I clicked on the Russian one down here. I clicked on this Russian one and it came up and it's written in German. So this is very German. I mean, this is 1884. This is the very last one you're going to find written in German in this record set. But it's interesting that even though this is scary, I'm looking at Russian, I'm like, I'm going to see Russian. I clicked in and got German. So that is actually pretty common. I've seen that more than once. Oh, I don't know where those went. We'll just skip it. The other big websites, Ancestry, MyHeritage, Find My Past Fillet. These are good. Ancestry has a lot of index records. It's great. Ancestry, if you want American records on your ancestors, this is fantastic. If you have Jewish ancestry from Russia, you actually can find a lot. You have to go into the card catalog. They don't list them as Germans from Russia, so you have to know what province and what town basically you're looking for. So they have the Saratov province, and they have St. Petersburg, and they have like Odessa. They don't have Odessa in there, but well, they do have Odessa actually. So you go in there and you click on those, and they'll give you their little, you put in the information you want, and they'll search for you. So it can be helpful. It's not like super intuitive. You just have to know what you're looking for. MyHeritage and Find My Past were great if you have family trees. I checked a lot of the family trees. Some of them have sources, most of them did not. Most of them were just copies of each other, and it's a great starting point. So it's definitely something worth looking into. The one thing that Ancestry and MyHeritage has is DNA, and Ancestry has a Germans from Russia DNA subgroup that if you are part of, it will automatically put you in. And then you have all access to people who are related to you, who are also searching for their ancestors, and they are on Ancestry, and they're, like it's fantastic way to find relatives. And honestly, that's a great resource. So that's what I would use that for. MyHeritage also has a lot of Germans from Russia resources, DNA, like families on there too. So that's what I would use them the most for. So let's talk about quickly language helps. And we talked about that you're going to encounter both German and Russian old script. This is just that you're going to in any capacity when you're researching them. Even if you're looking in America, sometimes the US, you're going to find some of the records in German. They did speak German up until the end of World War II when they felt like they had to stop a lot of these communities. So the important thing is know some of the key words. Like know your colony's name in Russian and German, know your family's name in Russian and German. Like make make little like word charts for yourself or letter charts for yourself in Russian and German. I mean, it is taxing, it's a lot of work, but it's kind of fun, obviously, I think so, but it's exciting too to be able to find them. The other thing is learn to use AI. It's available to us now. It's important that we learn how to use it as research in genealogy. It's probably the biggest thing that's happened to us in a long time. It's kind of exciting. It's getting better and better. And I'll show you just a quick one that I did real quick. And then use tutorials and videos for guidance. Well, there's so many available, and we'll talk about some of those. So some of the transcription and translation helps that I use regularly is BYU script tutorial. It's fantastic. It was written by students and professors. They go through and give you documents and examples. They show you how letters are written in some of them. It's a fantastic way to learn old script or to be able to parse out old script if you need to. Family Search has a lot of great tutorials as well. They will teach you about German old script. They'll teach you about Russian. I mean, it's fantastic. And then they're experts in their fields and they're teaching you. It's a great way to learn. Google Gemini AI, I was recommended to by some people. I have not personally used it, but I know a lot of genealogists that do. And they claim that you can sometimes get the written words out of it. Leo AI, these are all linked in your resource guide. I used right here. This is an expulsion document from 1940 from the German to a German from Russia, an expulsion document. And it did give me all of the written words over here. You can see that, or the typed words. And then I did take these and put them into Google Translate because it's online. And I was able to figure out what it said, but I did not get this handwriting. So it's learning and it's getting better. And the more we use it, the better it's going to get. And that's exciting. So Google Translate is definitely not your best bet. It's good to use in a pinch like I did, but it's not something you should rely on. One of the most important transcription and translation helps that I've used is dictionaries, honestly. If you can find an old dictionary from the time that your ancestors lived, there's going to be a lot of information that you just is not going to translate nowadays, a lot of words, even if you parse it out. So those are a great help for you. Okay, so let's talk about Germans from Russia genealogy groups. These are very important. When I first found out I was German from Russia, I did not understand the importance of these groups, but I do now. So the most important things that these groups do is it's a networking. It puts you in contact with other Germans from Russia, from your same villages, from your same area. I mean, and you get to use the knowledge that they have. There's no reason for all of us to do all of our own research when we can help each other, especially if they're reliable. So these organizations have experts in them, and I'm sorry for the provides the, anyways. These organizations provide professional genealogical research. They will set up appointments with you. You can call the village coordinators. You can get appointments with groups. You can go to their conventions. They send out newsletters. They're a fantastic resource for Germans from Russia. This is their life's work. Again, these people are very passionate about what they do. They facilitate networking. We just talked about this. They connect you with other people. And it's for all research levels. So if you don't know anything, you can come and then join them and they will help you. And if you know a lot, then they'll use you. And it's fantastic to be part of a group like this when you're from a unique group like Germans from Russia. Another really important thing that I feel like is quite the hidden gem that I've really used a lot lately is Facebook groups. There is a group for everything you can imagine for genealogy on Facebook. If you just search it, I just searched Mennonite genealogy and I just got 20 groups that came up. Most of these groups are private groups, and these are just some of the groups that I'm part of. So Mennonite genealogy, we have Russian Mennonites in Ukraine, we have Society for German Genealogy in Eastern Europe. We have Germans from Russia, history and genealogy. We have Germans genealogy in Ukraine. I mean, and if you look over here, these are mostly private groups. So when you ask to join, they'll ask you questions like, why do you want to be part of us? Tell me about your last names. And if you're a German from Russia, it'll be easy to get in. The other thing is, look how many members they have. 28,000 members in this group. This one has 11,000. This one has 36,000. The thing that is really cool about these groups is they have a lot of experts in them. Some of them have been started by professionals. A lot of them are led by professionals. A lot of them, a lot of the people we have, especially like we have Germans in Ukraine, a lot of these people speak Russian and German. So a lot of times you can say, hey, I have this document from my great grandma. Can somebody please translate and transcribe this for me? And they'll do it. And within an hour, you'll have your whole document transcribed. And if they're wrong, it's so funny because the people in the group are like, actually, you're wrong. And they'll retranscribe it for you. Like, they're very passionate about what they do. It's a great resource. The other thing that I've learned from them, there's a lot of information sharing. They share their resources. They're very accommodating with that. They share like websites they find. They say, hey, I did this. I found this AI thing. It's a great resource. I found a lot of things on my personal family in these groups because people will say, hey, do you know who this picture is? And recently someone put a picture up and it was like, do you know who this is? And I said, well, it looks like my dad. And you can figure out who this is because, it's so interesting to watch 20,000 people come together to solve mysteries for you, and they do have a lot of experience and they're from all over the world. So that's a great thing to do. If you have questions on those, I'm happy to answer them. But honestly, if you just Google them, you will, or if you search them in Facebook, you'll find what you're looking for. I've seen Bohemian Germans, I've seen like anything you could want, as niche as you need it to be. The other important thing about Germans from Russia, there is very specific events and conferences set up for Germans from Russia. Like I said, they like to gather together. They like to tell their history. They had a really hard history. They're very resilient and they want to talk about it. The good thing about conferences is the attendees can learn from their experts. And these are mostly put on from the Germans from Russia groups. Like I'll go back real quick. These groups right here, the American Historical Society of Germans from Russia or Germans from Russia group. These are great groups. They're worth it. They usually charge a small fee, but they're worth the small fee. It's like $10 a year or something. I don't quote me on that. But the conferences provide opportunities to connect with people. I found relatives at conferences. I mean, I found so much information at conferences. It's just fascinating to watch. You know what I mean? Some of them have mini conferences. Once a month, they have a special guest speaker, or they have educational classes weekly or monthly. Some of them do research classes for you. Like every Saturday they get together and they research your ancestors with you. They have book clubs, they have storytelling clubs, they share their ancestral records, like they open up their family Bibles and share them. Like these are great resources for you if you are part of this group. And they talk about history a lot. It's been fascinating to learn. So one more quick thing in conclusion. This is a very unique group of people. I do want to, as I've been researching them recently for this webinar, I found that Russia and Ukraine have both acknowledged the harm that they've done to Germans from Russia. They're very, it's a very healing attitude towards them now. And I do want to say that Russia didn't do what was wrong for their citizens necessarily. it was a very hard time in history, and there's no judgments here, but this Germans from Russia groups are very connected because of what they've been through together. And honestly, most of us still have aunts or cousins, second cousins in Germany or in Russia or in Kazakhstan. And these are very close groups, and you do get connected through these groups and through like the DNA stuff. So thank you for listening. I hope this helped if you're researching your ancestors. Really quick, I'll just do my attributions. All of these images were public domain or personal things, except for the couple that were right here. So thank you everybody for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar on September 3rd with Ada Nelson about Family Search for Latinos, reviewing AI indexed records. A recording of this webinar will be made available by next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow our Facebook and Twitter accounts. Thank you and have a wonderful week.